It all started 6 months ago when my electricity bill hit an all-time high. Summer in Arizona is no joke, and my air conditioning was working overtime just to keep my house bearable. I stood in my kitchen, staring at the three-digit number on the bill with growing frustration. There had to be a better way. My name is Alex, and I have lived in Sunnyside Estates for 5 years now. My home is modest compared to some of the mini mansions in our neighborhood. A single-story, three-bedroom Southwest-style home with a red tile roof and a small garden that I meticulously maintain. What it lacks in size, it makes up for in character and comfort. It is my sanctuary, my piece of the American dream. I worked hard to afford it, saving for years while living in a cramped apartment. Sunnyside Estates is the picture of suburban perfection. The streets are immaculately clean, the lawns perfectly manicured, and the houses all follow a pleasing southwestern architectural theme. This perfection does not come naturally. It is enforced by one of the strictest homeowners associations in the county. When I first moved in, I received a handbook of rules that was thicker than some novels I have read. After researching my options for reducing my energy costs, solar power emerged as the clear solution. Not only would it slash my electricity bills, but it also aligned with my environmental values. I have always believed in doing my part to combat climate change, and generating clean energy seemed like the perfect way to contribute while also saving money. The initial investment was substantial, nearly $30,000, but the long-term savings and tax incentives made it worthwhile. Before moving forward, I did my homework thoroughly. I spent evenings poring over the HOA handbook, highlighting sections related to home modifications and external installations. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that specifically prohibited solar panels. To be extra cautious, I even found examples of similar installations in neighboring communities to use as references for the aesthetics. I submitted my application to the HOA Architectural Review Committee with detailed plans, specifications, and even a mock-up of how the installation would look from the street. After 3 weeks of nervous waiting, I received approval. It was conditional. The panels needed to be installed in a way that minimized visibility from the street, but it was approval nonetheless. I was ecstatic. Installation day was one of the most exciting days since I bought the house. The workers arrived early, and I watched with growing anticipation as they secured the mounting hardware and carefully positioned each panel. By afternoon, the system was complete. The sleek black panels gleamed in the sunlight, tilted to capture maximum solar exposure while remaining as unobtrusive as possible from the street view. That evening, I sat in my backyard, cold drink in hand, admiring my contribution to a greener future and looking forward to lower utility bills. The first indications of trouble came 3 days later. While watering my front garden, I noticed Mrs. Peterson across the street watching me with an odd expression. When I waved, she quickly looked away and hurried inside. Later that day, I saw two neighbors walking past my house, slowing down to point at my roof and whispering to each other. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but I dismissed it as paranoia. 1 week after the installation, I returned home from work to find a white envelope in my mailbox with the HOA logo printed in the corner. My heart sank as I opened it, somehow knowing what I would find inside. The letter was printed on heavy cardstock, with the heading, "Notice of Violation," in bold letters across the top. I stood in my driveway, the afternoon sun suddenly feeling too hot on my neck as I read words that would set in motion a battle I never anticipated fighting. The violation notice claimed my solar panels were an eyesore that diminished neighborhood aesthetic standards and installed without proper authorization. This made no sense. I had received written approval. I immediately called the HOA office and was told that the architectural committee's decision had been overruled by the board president, who determined the panels violated the general harmony of the community. The next morning, a sharp knock on my door interrupted my breakfast. I opened it to find a woman I had seen at neighborhood gatherings but never actually met. She stood on my doorstep like she owned it, designer sunglasses perched on her head, an expensive handbag dangling from her arm, and a tight smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning. I am Karen Winters, the new president of the Sunnyside Estates HOA," she said, extending a hand with perfectly manicured nails. "I thought it would be appropriate to discuss your violation in person." I invited her in, maintaining politeness despite my growing irritation. We sat at my kitchen table, where I had spread out my approval documents and the HOA handbook. "Ms. Winters, I have written approval from the architectural committee," I explained, sliding the document toward her. "As you can see, I followed all guidelines." Karen barely glanced at the paper. The committee made an error in judgment. As president, I have the authority to review and overturn decisions that compromise our community standards. Her voice was calm but unyielding. "Those panels are visible from the street, and they disrupt the visual cohesion of our neighborhood." "But there is nothing in the rules specifically prohibiting solar panels," I countered, opening the handbook to the sections I had highlighted. Karen smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her linen pants. "Section 8, paragraph 4 states that all exterior modifications must maintain the aesthetic integrity of the community as determined by the board. Those black rectangles on your roof do not meet that standard." She pointed toward my ceiling, as if she could see through it to the offending panels. "They need to be removed within 60 days, or we will begin assessing fines of $100 per day." I took a deep breath, trying to remain reasonable. "These panels cost me $30,000 to install. They are environmentally friendly and will eventually pay for themselves in energy savings. Surely we can find a compromise." "The environment is not my concern. Property values are," she stood, signaling the end of our discussion. "The solar panels were a poor investment on your part. Perhaps next time you will consult with the board before making such drastic changes to your home." After she left, I sat stunned at my kitchen table. The encounter had left me shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. This was not just about solar panels. It was about power and control. I decided to reach out to neighbors to gain some perspective. Over the next few days, I spoke with several homeowners who had their own stories about Karen Winters. Tom Garcia told me how she had forced him to remove a basketball hoop from his driveway because it was 2 inches taller than regulation. Maria Johnson shared that Karen had personally measured the height of her garden flowers, citing her for plants that exceeded 24 inches. Most disturbing was Robert Lee's account of being fined for having his garage door open for more than 30 minutes while he worked on a project. A pattern emerged of selective enforcement and personal vendettas. Karen seemed to target certain homeowners while ignoring violations by her friends and allies on the board. I spent late nights researching HOA laws and regulations, learning that while homeowners associations had considerable power, they were not above the law. They had to follow their own established procedures and could not enforce rules arbitrarily. Despite the intimidation and the financial risk, I decided to stand my ground. This was about more than just solar panels now. It was about fairness, about not allowing one person to tyrannize an entire neighborhood. I drafted a formal appeal to the HOA board, citing the initial approval and the lack of specific prohibitions against solar panels in the bylaws. As I sealed the envelope, I had no idea of the escalation that was about to unfold. The following weeks brought a new level of harassment. Every day around 9:30 in the morning, Karen would slowly drive by my house in her white Mercedes SUV. She did not bother to be subtle about her surveillance. She would stop directly across from my driveway, hold up her phone to take pictures of my roof, and then drive away. The message was clear. I was being watched. I began documenting these drive-bys, noting the times and taking pictures from my window. Other neighbors noticed as well. One evening, Emma from 2 doors down stopped by with cookies. "I have seen what Karen is doing," she said quietly, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "She did the same thing to us when we wanted to plant a fruit tree in our backyard. Just wore us down until we gave up." 2 weeks after submitting my appeal, I received notice of a special HOA meeting scheduled specifically to address aesthetic violations undermining community standards. The location was the community center, and attendance was strongly encouraged for all homeowners. I knew this was about my solar panels. I arrived early, armed with research on solar access laws in our state, printouts of my approval documentation, and even photographs of other communities with solar installations that enhanced property values. I felt prepared, confident that logic and facts would prevail. As people filed in, I noticed the subtle social divisions. Karen sat at a table at the front with 4 other board members, while her circle of neighborhood allies clustered in the first 2 rows of chairs. Other homeowners, those who had shared their own stories of Karen's tyranny with me, offered small smiles or nods of encouragement as they found seats. Karen called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. "Thank you all for coming to this important discussion about maintaining the standards that make Sunnyside Estates the premier community in this area," she began. "We have a pressing issue that threatens the visual harmony we all value." A projector flickered to life, displaying a large photograph of my house with the solar panels clearly visible. The image had been edited to emphasize their prominence, with shadows darkened and contrast increased to make them appear more obtrusive than they actually were. "As you can see," Karen continued, gesturing to the screen, "these installations are inconsistent with our community aesthetic. Our bylaws exist to protect your property values and the investment you have all made in your homes." She then introduced a real estate agent, later discovered to be her cousin, who gave a presentation about how non-standard modifications could potentially decrease home values by up to 15%. There was no specific data about solar panels, just vague references to unsightly additions and personal modifications. When the time came for community input, I raised my hand immediately. Karen acknowledged several other speakers first, all of whom expressed concerns about setting a dangerous precedent if exceptions were made. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, she grudgingly called on me. I stood, documents in hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I would like to point out that my solar installation received initial approval from the Architectural Committee." I held up the approval letter. "Additionally, there is nothing in our bylaws specifically prohibiting solar panels. In fact, our state has solar access laws that—" "We are aware of your documentation," Karen interrupted, her voice sharp. "However, the board has final authority on architectural matters. Your time is up. Next speaker, please." "But I have not even had a chance to," I protested. "Next speaker," Karen repeated, voice rising as she tapped her gavel. The meeting continued in this fashion, with supporters of the board given ample time to speak, while those with questions or concerns were quickly silenced. When the time came to vote, Karen called for a show of hands on a motion to enforce aesthetic standards regarding roof installations. The wording was deliberately vague, never mentioning solar panels specifically. Board members and their allies raised their hands immediately. Other homeowners looked uncomfortable but slowly raised their hands as well, unwilling to publicly oppose the board. The motion passed by an overwhelming majority. The next day, I received an official letter giving me 30 days to remove the panels or face daily fines plus potential liens on my property. I consulted with a lawyer, who explained that while solar access laws provided some protection, fighting the HOA would be costly and time-consuming with no guarantee of success. Given the financial risk, he reluctantly advised compliance while seeking other remedies. The day the workers came to remove my panels was one of the worst of my life. Each panel carefully dismantled represented not just thousands of dollars wasted, but also the triumph of pettiness over progress, of arbitrary power over reasonable accommodation. I watched from my living room window, unable to bear being outside as my investment was carted away. Through a gap in my curtains, I saw Karen standing across the street, arms crossed in satisfaction, watching the entire process. When the last panel was loaded into the truck, she raised her coffee mug in a mocking toast before walking back to her house. That night I calculated my losses, the non-refundable installation costs, the removal fees, the depreciation on the equipment. The total came to nearly $18,000, money I would never recover. As I sat surrounded by paperwork and receipts, the weight of defeat pressed down on me like a physical thing. The weeks following the removal of my solar panels were dark ones, both literally and figuratively. I found myself avoiding neighbors, taking longer routes to avoid driving past Karen's house, and spending evenings staring at my now empty roof, calculating how long it would take to recover from this financial blow. My electricity bills returned to their previous eye-watering amounts, adding insult to injury. Rain pattered against my windows one evening as I sat at my dining table, surrounded by various documents related to my failed solar project. I had intended to organize everything into a folder to put the whole ordeal behind me, but found myself unable to let go. There had to be something I had missed, some recourse I had not considered. Among the solar installation documents were the original papers from when I purchased my home 5 years earlier. I had not looked at them since closing day, but now I leafed through them idly, more out of distraction than purpose. The property deed, inspection reports, title insurance, standard paperwork that had seemed so important then and so irrelevant now. A crack of thunder startled me, and a flash of lightning briefly illuminated the room. In that moment of brightness, my eyes fell on a section of the deed I had never paid attention to before. It mentioned something about utility easements and retained infrastructure rights. Curious, I pulled the document closer. The paragraph was dense with legal terminology, referring to Grand Tour's reservation of subsurface utility corridors and electrical distribution nodes located on Lot 42. Lot 42, that was my property. I reached for my reading glasses and a highlighter, suddenly alert despite the late hour. The following morning, I called the county record's office as soon as they opened. The clerk sounded bored as I explained what I was looking for, but became more engaged when I mentioned the specific easement language. "That development has an unusual history," she said. "You might want to come in person to look at the original plat maps and development plans." 3 hours later, I was hunched over a large table in the record's office, surrounded by blueprints, development plans, and property records dating back 30 years. The story that emerged was fascinating. Sunnyside Estates had been built on land previously owned by a utility company. When the land was sold for development, certain infrastructure elements remained under the original owner's control, including a small electrical substation that distributed power to the entire community. That substation was located underground at the edge of my property. The original utility company had eventually been acquired by a larger energy corporation, which had then divested certain non-core assets during a restructuring. Those assets included the Sunnyside Estates power infrastructure. The rights had transferred through a series of corporate entities until they apparently disappeared from active management. But they had not disappeared legally. According to the documents, whoever owned Lot 42, my home, retained the rights to the electrical easement and the infrastructure built upon it. It seemed the developer had incorporated this unusual arrangement into the property deed, perhaps assuming the homeowner would never notice or understand the implications. I needed expert confirmation. I scheduled an appointment with Patricia Lawson, a real estate attorney specializing in property rights. Her office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, with dark wood paneling and law books lining the walls. The atmosphere projected competence and stability, exactly what I needed. I laid out the documents on her desk, trying to contain my excitement as she reviewed them with a practiced eye. She occasionally made notes or reached for reference books, her expression unreadable behind tortoiseshell glasses. After nearly an hour of review, she looked up. "This is highly unusual," she said, removing her glasses. "But the language is quite clear. As the owner of Lot 42, you have inherited the rights to the electrical easement and the infrastructure that services Sunnyside Estates. This includes the substation and distribution network." "What exactly does that mean in practical terms?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. "It means you have legal authority over the neighborhood's electrical infrastructure," she explained, tapping the documents with her pen. "You could, in theory, control access to maintenance, approve or deny modifications, and even," she paused, studying my face carefully, "regulate power distribution, though there would be regulatory considerations involved." "Could the HOA challenge this?" I asked. "They could try, but these rights were established before the HOA existed. They were incorporated into your property deed and have never been formally transferred to the association. Your position is legally sound." She leaned back in her chair. "May I ask why you are suddenly interested in these easement rights?" I hesitated, then told her about the solar panels, Corinne's campaign against me, and the financial loss I had suffered. As I spoke, Patricia's expression shifted from professional interest to something like admiration. "I see," she said when I finished. "Well, I cannot advise you to use these rights as leverage or retaliation. That would be unprofessional of me." A small smile played at the corner of her mouth. "I can, however, help you understand exactly what your rights entail and how to properly exercise them within legal boundaries." I left her office 2 hours later with a file folder containing copies of all relevant documents, a detailed explanation of my rights and limitations regarding the electrical infrastructure, and a newfound sense of possibility. As I walked to my car, the clouds that had been present for weeks parted and warm sunlight streamed down. I stood for a moment, face turned upward, absorbing the light and warmth. For the first time since losing my solar panels, I felt something like hope. The universe had handed me an unexpected card to play. Now I needed to decide exactly how and when to play it. Over the next 3 weeks, I transformed my dining room into a command center for what I now thought of as Operation Power Play. The table disappeared under maps of the neighborhood, electrical diagrams obtained from the county, printouts of relevant laws and regulations, and a growing file of documented HOA abuses collected from sympathetic neighbors. My first step was to fully understand the technical aspects of what I was dealing with. I consulted with Miguel Suarez, an electrical engineer who specialized in power grid infrastructure. After signing a confidentiality agreement, he reviewed the documents and visited my property to inspect the access points to the substation. "This is a simple but critical node," he explained as we stood over a nondescript utility cover at the back corner of my lot. "It distributes power to approximately 50 homes in the immediate area. The infrastructure is old but well maintained." "Is there a way to control the distribution selectively?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Miguel gave me a knowing look. "Technically speaking, yes. The system has manual override capabilities that would allow sectional control." He hesitated. "May I ask what you are planning?" "Just understanding my options," I replied. "If I needed to facilitate maintenance or address an issue, I want to know what can be done." He nodded, not entirely convinced but professional enough not to press further. Before leaving, he provided detailed information about safety procedures, regulatory requirements, and the specific mechanisms that would allow for controlled access to different sections of the grid. I paid his consultation fee and added his findings to my growing collection of documents. Next, I needed to gather evidence of Karen's pattern of targeted enforcement and HOA overreach. This proved surprisingly easy. Once word spread discreetly that someone was finally standing up to Karen, neighbors began to come forward with their stories. I invited them over one by one, recording their experiences and collecting copies of violation notices, correspondence, and photographic evidence. Tom Garcia shared security camera footage of Karen measuring his basketball hoop with a tape measure at 6:30 in the morning. Maria Johnson had documented every interaction regarding her garden, including Karen's repeated visits with a ruler. Most valuable was Robert Lee's meticulous record of selective enforcement, photographs showing violations at Karen's friends' houses that went uncited, while identical issues at other homes received immediate notices. I organized this evidence chronologically, creating a compelling narrative of abusive authority. The corkboard in my dining room filled with index cards and connecting strings, visually mapping the pattern of harassment. Standing back and looking at it all together was both disturbing and empowering. The case against Karen's leadership was overwhelming when presented as a unified story rather than isolated incidents. While building my case, I also drafted a formal letter asserting my rights over the electrical infrastructure. Patricia Lawson reviewed multiple versions, helping me strike the perfect balance between assertiveness and professionalism. The final document stated my legal position clearly, outlined the historical documentation supporting my claims, and laid out reasonable terms for ongoing cooperation between myself and the HOA regarding the power grid. The technical preparations required more subtlety. Based on Miguel's guidance, I purchased and installed monitoring equipment that would allow me to safely and legally access the control mechanisms for the neighborhood power distribution. I was careful to stay within regulatory guidelines. This was about establishing leverage, not breaking laws or endangering anyone. I also set up small security cameras around my property, particularly focused on the utility access points and the street in front of my house. If Karen or anyone else attempted to interfere with my legal rights, I would have documentation. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I discovered that Karen was planning her annual HOA Appreciation Gala. This lavish event, held at her home, was essentially a celebration of her own authority, an evening where board members and favored neighbors gathered to congratulate themselves on maintaining their perfect community. The invitations had gone out, embossed with gold lettering, requesting the pleasure of selected neighbors' company on Saturday evening at 7:00 p.m. I watched from my window as decorators arrived at Corinne's house the day before the event. Workers set up string lights across her expansive backyard and unloaded catering equipment from a van. Corinne supervised it all, gesturing imperiously as tables were arranged, and a small platform was constructed for speeches. I checked my watch and smiled. By this time tomorrow, the balance of power in Sunnyside Estates would shift dramatically. I sealed the formal letter, gathered my documentation, and reviewed my plan one final time. As the sun set over the neighborhood, I whispered to myself, perfect timing. Saturday evening arrived with perfect weather for an outdoor gala. From my vantage point, I could see guests arriving at Corinne's house in formal attire, greeted at the door by Corinne herself in a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. String lights twinkled in her backyard, and the murmur of conversation and laughter drifted through the neighborhood as the party got underway. I watched the clock carefully, tracking the event based on the schedule I had obtained from a sympathetic caterer. Drinks and mingling from 7:00 to 7:45, dinner from 7:45 to 8:30, and then Corinne's annual State of the Neighborhood address at 8:30 sharp. Everything hinged on timing. At 8:25, I put my plan into action. Dressed in a professional outfit with a clipboard and flashlight, I made my way to the utility access point in my backyard. I had practiced this procedure multiple times under Miguel's guidance, ensuring I could execute it flawlessly. With methodical precision, I activated the controls that would selectively restrict power to Corinne's street only, leaving the rest of the neighborhood unaffected. The changes took effect immediately. From my position, I could hear the sudden shift from music and laughter to confused murmurs. I grabbed my prepared documents, placed them in a leather portfolio, and walked purposefully toward Corinne's house. The scene that greeted me was exactly as I had imagined. Corinne's perfectly orchestrated gala had descended into chaos. The string lights hung dark and lifeless. Guests stood in clusters, illuminated only by the glow of cell phone flashlights. Servers froze in confusion, holding trays of food they could no longer see properly. And in the center of it all stood Corinne, her face barely visible in the darkness but her voice unmistakable as she demanded that someone call the power company immediately. I approached the gathering, my powerful flashlight cutting through the darkness. Heads turned toward me as I made my entrance. "Good evening, everyone," I called out, my voice carrying across the sudden silence. "I believe I might be able to help with the power situation." Corinne squinted against my light. "What are you doing here? You were not invited." "No, but I think you will want to hear what I have to say," I replied, maintaining a calm, professional tone. "Perhaps we could gather the board members for a brief discussion." Curiosity overcame hostility, and soon I was surrounded by Corinne and the 4 other HOA board members, all looking expectantly at me in the glow of various flashlights and cell phones. Other guests hovered nearby, eager to understand what was happening. "I have recently discovered some interesting information about our neighborhood's infrastructure," I began, opening my portfolio and handing copies of the key documents to each board member. "As it happens, my property, Lot 42, includes legal rights to the electrical easement and infrastructure that services Sunnyside Estates. These rights were established before the HOA existed and have never been transferred." Board members squinted at the papers in the dim light, confusion evident on their faces. Corinne snatched the documents from a fellow board member to examine them herself. "This is ridiculous," she declared. "The HOA controls all common elements and infrastructure." "Not in this case," I replied, producing additional documentation. As you can see from these county records and the legal opinion I have included, the electrical distribution system is legally under my authority. This has been confirmed by both the county recorder's office and a property rights attorney. As the implications began to sink in, I continued, my voice clear and steady in the darkness. I have also compiled a comprehensive record of HOA violations and selective enforcement under the current leadership. I removed a thick folder from my portfolio. This includes documented instances of targeted harassment, arbitrary rule changes, and procedural violations in HOA governance. I began to list specific examples, watching as heads nodded in recognition. The basketball hoop that was 2 inches too tall, the garden flowers that exceeded the height limit by 1 inch, the garage door left open for maintenance, and of course, the solar panels that were approved and then arbitrarily deemed unacceptable. With each example, murmurs of agreement grew among the gathering crowd. Cell phone lights illuminated faces showing recognition and dawning understanding. "This is preposterous," Karen interrupted, her voice rising in pitch. "You cannot just show up at a private event making wild accusations and threatening our community." "I am not threatening anyone," I replied calmly. "I am simply informing the board of the legal reality and suggesting a path forward." I turned to address the full gathering. "The power outage affecting this street is likely temporary and coincidental, but it does illustrate the importance of reliable, sustainable energy solutions, like solar power." Richard Martinez, the HOA treasurer, spoke up. "These documents appear legitimate. If what you are saying is true, what exactly do you want?" I laid out my terms clearly. Reinstatement of my solar panel approval, a review of all HOA decisions made under Karen's leadership, establishment of clear and fair enforcement procedures, and formation of a community renewable energy committee. "Either we move forward with these reasonable reforms," I concluded, "or I will be forced to exercise my full legal rights regarding the electrical infrastructure, which could involve complicated access issues for future maintenance and upgrades." Karen's face contorted with rage, visible even in the dim light. "This is blackmail. You cannot hold an entire neighborhood hostage because you are bitter about your ugly solar panels." "It is not blackmail to exercise legitimate legal rights," I countered. "And I am not holding anyone hostage. I am proposing a fair resolution that benefits the entire community." Other homeowners began to voice support for my proposals. Those who had suffered under Karen's selective enforcement shared their own stories, emboldened by the darkness and the sudden shift in power dynamics. As the testimonies mounted, board members huddled together, whispering urgently. Finally, Richard stepped forward. "We will need to verify these claims independently, but if they prove accurate, the board should consider your proposals seriously. Could we meet tomorrow morning to discuss this further?" I nodded, handing him my card with contact information. "I look forward to a productive conversation. In the meantime, I imagine everyone would appreciate the restoration of power to continue enjoying the evening." With that, I excused myself and walked away, leaving the board members and party guests in a state of bewildered anticipation. As I reached the sidewalk, I heard Karen's shrill voice demanding that someone do something and calling my actions extortion. Her protests faded as I walked home, pulled out my phone, and sent a text message to Miguel. Moments later, the street behind me blazed with light as power was fully restored. I stood in my driveway, looking back at Karen's now illuminated house. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. For the first time in months, I slept soundly. The emergency HOA board meeting convened at 9, 8:00 a.m. the following morning in the sunlit community center. Word had spread quickly, and the room was packed with homeowners eager to witness the proceedings. Karen arrived last, sitting apart from the other board members who had clearly already been in discussion. Her usual confident demeanor had been replaced by tight-lipped tension. Richard Martinez called the meeting to order, his tone markedly different from the rubber-stamp proceedings of the past. "We have verified the documents presented last night regarding the electrical easement rights associated with Lot 42, he announced. "Our attorney confirms that these rights are indeed valid and legally enforceable." A murmur ran through the room. Karen stared straight ahead, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. "In light of this and other information that has come to our attention, the board proposes the following resolutions," Richard continued. "First, immediate reinstatement of the solar panel approval for Lot 42, with the HOA covering reasonable reinstallation costs as compensation for the improper revocation." Applause broke out, quickly silenced by Richard raising his hand. "Second, a comprehensive review of all violation notices and fines issued in the past year, with appropriate adjustments or refunds where warranted. Third, establishment of a transparent enforcement procedure requiring documentation and board consensus rather than unilateral action." He looked directly at me. "Finally, creation of a community renewable energy committee to develop guidelines for environmentally friendly home improvements, including solar installations, rain collection systems, and native landscaping." The vote was called. 4 hands went up immediately in favor of the resolutions. Karen alone kept her hand down, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Richard turned to Karen. "In addition, the board has voted to request your resignation as president, effective immediately, due to documented abuses of authority and failure to follow established HOA procedures." Karen stood abruptly. "This is a witch hunt. You will be hearing from my attorney." She gathered her designer handbag and stalked out, the door closing firmly behind her. The transformation of Sunnyside Estates began almost immediately. The solar panel reinstallation became a neighborhood event, with curious residents stopping by to ask questions and several expressing interest in their own installations. The Renewable Energy Committee, which I was asked to chair, developed reasonable guidelines that balanced aesthetic considerations with environmental benefits. 3 months later, Karen's house went on the market. A moving truck appeared shortly thereafter, loading her possessions while neighbors pretended not to watch. No one organized a goodbye party. The solar panels once again gleam on my roof, capturing energy and reducing my electricity bills. But more importantly, they represent something larger, a community finding its voice and reclaiming its power from those who would abuse it. 6 other homes in the neighborhood now sport similar installations, with more applications in process. Last week, we held the first neighborhood sustainability fair on the community center grounds. Residents shared information about energy efficiency, native gardening, and water conservation. Children played on the lawn while adults discussed solar co-ops and community composting programs. As the sun set over our gathering, I found myself standing next to Emma, the neighbor who had brought me cookies during the darkest days of the conflict. "Look at what you started," she said, gesturing to the thriving community around us. "All because you would not give up." I smiled, watching the golden light reflect off solar panels now visible on several rooftops. "Sometimes losing one battle leads to winning a greater war," I replied. "And sometimes power comes in unexpected forms." In the end, Karen had taught me an unintended lesson. True power does not come from controlling others, but from standing firm for what is right and bringing people together around a common purpose. As I looked across my transformed neighborhood, I realized that illumination comes in many forms, not just from the sun above or the electricity we generate, but from the light that shines when a community discovers its strength and purpose.